Hush, hound. Tonight's story comes from pawprints left long ago. Welcome to Hush Hounds, Pawprints of History. Laika, the Conqueror of Space. If you are joining us for sleep, it's time to close your eyes now. Breathe slowly in and out. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension leave your body as you melt slowly into the surface you are on. We're going to tell a story tonight, a true story, a difficult story, but we'll tell it gently and with care, because some stories need to be remembered, even when they're hard, especially when they're hard. So let yourself settle into this moment, into this quiet space where we can hold difficult truths softly, where we can witness history without being overwhelmed by it. Tonight we're going back in time, back to 1957, back to a moment when the world was changing faster than anyone could have imagined, back to a time of fear and wonder, of competition and discovery, of terrible choices made in the name of progress. And at the centre of this moment, caught in forces far beyond her understanding, was a small dog, a stray from the streets of Moscow, a dog who would become more famous than most humans, a dog whose name you probably know, even if you don't know her story. Her name was Laika. Let's begin. She was small. That's the first thing you need to know. Small and a mixed breed and unremarkable in almost every way. The kind of dog you might walk past on the street without a second glance. Brown and white markings, pointed ears that stood up alertly, a face that was gentle, observant, intelligent, in that quiet way that street dogs often are. Laika, the name means barker in Russian, a common name for a dog. Nothing special about it, nothing that hinted at what was to come. She was found on the streets of Moscow, a stray, living the hard life that stray dogs live, scrounging for food, finding shelter where she could, avoiding the dangers that city streets hold for small animals. She'd survived, which meant she was smart, tough, adaptable. These qualities would be both her salvation and her doom. We don't know much about her life before she was found. We don't know if she had a favourite spot where she slept, a kind person who sometimes fed her, a territory she considered her own. Those details are lost to history. All we know is that one day she was living her life on the streets of Moscow, and the next day she was in a cage, selected for something no dog had ever done before. Soviet scientists preferred strays. This was deliberate. This was policy. They believed that dogs who had survived on the streets were tougher, more adaptable, more resilient than pets who had lived comfortable lives. Street dogs had already proven they could endure hardship. They'd survived cold Moscow winters. They'd gone hungry. They'd learnt to be cautious, to assess situations, to adapt to changing circumstances. These were the qualities the scientists needed, because what they had planned was harder than anything any dog had faced before. Laika was one of several strays collected for the space program. She wasn't the only one. There were others. Albina, Mashka, other dogs whose names history has mostly forgotten. But Laika would be the one chosen. Laika would be the one to go. The scientists who selected her noted several things. Her size, small enough to fit in a cramped capsule they were designing. Her temperament, unusually calm for a street dog, not aggressive, not overly fearful. Her health, good, despite the hard life she'd lived. And something else, something harder to quantify, a kind of acceptance, a willingness to tolerate handling, confinement, and strange procedures. She would later become the first living creature to orbit the Earth. Not the first living thing in space. Fruit flies had gone up in captured German rockets after World War II. Not even the first animal in space. The Soviets had already sent dogs on suborbital flights up and back down. But the first to orbit, the first to cycle the planet in the black void beyond the atmosphere, the first to see the Earth as a sphere suspended in darkness. This small, unremarkable stray dog would achieve what no human had yet achieved. She would go where no living being had gone before. Her heart would beat in zero gravity. Her eyes would see, though we can never know what she understood of what she saw, the curve of the Earth against the stars. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That moment is still to come. For now, Laika is just a small dog in a cage in a laboratory in Moscow. Just one of several strays who've been collected. Just a subject in an experiment. Not yet a hero. Not yet a symbol. Not yet a name that would echo through history. Just a dog, small and calm and unknowing. Living moment to moment as dogs do. Not understanding what's coming. Not able to understand. Just existing in the now. In this cage, in this strange new world of humans in white coats and bright lights, and the smell of antiseptic and fear. Breathe slowly. This is where the story begins, with a small dog in a big moment, caught in currents of history and politics and ambition that had nothing to do with her, that she had no way to comprehend, that would carry her to a place no living thing had ever been. This is Laika's story, and it begins, as so many difficult stories begin, with someone small and powerless, caught in something immense and unstoppable. To understand what happened to Laika, you need to understand the world she lived in, or rather, the world the humans around her lived in. Because Laika herself didn't understand politics or nations or the strange competition that had gripped the world's two superpowers. But that competition would determine her fate. The year was 1957. The Cold War was at its height. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a struggle for supremacy. Not just military supremacy, though that was part of it, but technological supremacy, scientific supremacy, the ability to demonstrate to the world that your system, communism or capitalism, was superior, that your nation was the future. And the new era for this competition was space. Space, the final frontier, as it would later be called. The vast darkness above the atmosphere, the realm of stars and planets, and the endless void. Humanity had dreamed of reaching space for centuries, but only now, in the 1950s, did the technology exist to actually attempt it. Both nations were racing to be the first to reach space, the first to orbit, the first to the moon, though that goal still seemed impossibly distant. Every achievement became a propaganda victory every milestone a chance to demonstrate superiority. On October the 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world. They launched Sputnik 1. Sputnik, the word means satellite or travelling companion in Russian. But Sputnik 1 was more than just a satellite. It was a statement. It was proof that the Soviets had rockets powerful enough to reach orbit. Rockets that could, theoretically, carry nuclear weapons to any point on Earth. Rockets that demonstrated Soviet technology was not backward, not inferior, but perhaps even ahead of the Americans. Sputnik 1 was small, a metal sphere about the size of a beach ball with 4 antennae protruding from it. It weighed less than 200 pounds, but it circled the Earth every 96 minutes, and as it passed overhead, it broadcast a simple radio signal, a sound that anyone with a radio receiver could hear, a sound that said, "We are here, we have done this, we are in space." The world was astonished. The Americans were horrified. They had thought they were ahead in the space race. They had their own satellite program, but it was behind schedule, plagued with problems, and now the Soviets had beaten them, dramatically, publicly, undeniably. The launch of Sputnik 1 created what historians would later call the Sputnik crisis, a moment of shock and fear in the West, a realization that the Soviet Union was a serious technological power, that the space race was real, that falling behind could have serious consequences. But for the Soviet leadership, Sputnik 1's success created a different kind of pressure. It created expectations. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, recognized the propaganda value of this achievement. He saw how it impressed the world, how it demonstrated Soviet capabilities, how it could be used to advance Soviet prestige and influence. And he wanted more, immediately. The 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution was approaching. November 7th, 1957, just 1 month after Sputnik 1's launch. This was a supremely important date in the Soviet calendar. The revolution that had created the Soviet Union, the beginning of the communist state, it needed to be celebrated with something spectacular. Khrushchev demanded another space spectacular for the anniversary, not just another satellite, something bigger, something living, something that would capture the world's imagination even more than Sputnik 1 had. He wanted to send a dog into orbit. The scientists were appalled. They explained that this was impossible, that they needed more time, that Sputnik 1 had taken years of preparation, that designing a spacecraft to keep an animal alive in orbit was vastly more complex than simply launching a metal sphere, that they needed at least a year, maybe 2, to develop the necessary systems. Khrushchev was unmoved. He wanted it done for the anniversary, 1 month away. The scientists had no choice. In the Soviet system, you did not say no to Khrushchev. You found a way, or you faced consequences. And so, Sputnik 2 was designed and built in less than a month, under extreme pressure. Think about that. Less than a month to design a spacecraft, to build it, to develop life support systems, to select and train an animal, to prepare a rocket, to launch, all in less than 4 weeks. It was impossible, but they did it anyway, working around the clock, cutting corners, making compromises, racing against the deadline that had nothing to do with safety or science or the well-being of the dog who would fly, and everything to do with the politics and prestige and propaganda. This is the context in which Laika's mission happened, not as a carefully planned scientific experiment, not as the next logical step in a methodical program, but as a rushed, desperate attempt to meet a political deadline, to give Khrushchev his spectacular anniversary celebration, to maintain Soviet momentum in the space race. The pace was breathless, frantic. There was no time to think through all the implications, no time to solve all the problems, no time to develop a recovery system that would bring Sputnik 2 and its passenger safely back to Earth, because that technology didn't exist yet, and there wasn't time to develop it. From the very beginning, everyone involved knew the truth, knew what the mission would mean for the dog chosen to fly, knew that this was a one-way journey, but the mission went forward anyway, because the deadline was absolute, because Khrushchev demanded it, because in the competition between nations, in the rush to demonstrate supremacy, one small dog's life was considered an acceptable cost. This was the world Laika lived in, a world of cold equations and geopolitical calculations, a world rushing towards space faster than wisdom or ethics could keep pace, a world where being first mattered more than being careful, where the spectacular mattered more than the humane. Laika didn't choose this world. She didn't understand it. She was just a small dog who'd been picked up off the streets, a dog who was about to become part of history in a way that would haunt the conscience of the world for decades to come. Breathe slowly. Let this context settle. This is not a story of villains and heroes. It's a story of humans making choices under pressure. Choices that prioritized achievement over ethics. Choices that we still struggle to reconcile with. Choices that matter precisely because they're so difficult. The world was rushing towards space, and Laika was caught in that rush. But Laika wasn't the first dog the Soviets sent towards space. She was part of a longer story, a program that had been developing for years. Understanding what came before helps us understand what happened to her. Soviet dog flights began in 1951, 6 years before Laika. 6 years of sending dogs up on rockets to see what would happen, to learn what living bodies could endure, to develop the knowledge that would eventually allow humans to follow. These early missions were suborbital. The rockets would blast up through the atmosphere, arc over in parabola, and fall back down, not into orbit. They didn't go fast enough for that, but high enough to reach space, high enough to experience weightlessness for a few minutes, high enough to test the systems and see if dogs could survive the experience. The flights tested many things. How high could a dog go and still survive? What would happen to a living body during the intense acceleration of launch? Could a dog breathe in a pressurized capsule? How did weightlessness affect them? What happened during the violent deceleration of re-entry? Could a parachute system bring the capsule safely down? Question after question, test after test, dog after dog. Some of these missions succeeded. The dogs went up and came back down, alive and relatively healthy. These were celebrated as triumphs, proof that living beings could survive spaceflight, proof that the systems worked. Some of these missions failed. Rockets exploded, parachutes didn't deploy, capsules were never found, dogs died. These failures were not publicised. They were studied quietly. Lessons were learned, improvements were made, and more dogs were sent up. The names of these early space dogs are largely forgotten now. Desig and Sigan, who flew in 1951, the first dogs to reach space and return alive. Albina, who flew multiple successful missions and survived them all. Baz and Lishika, who died when their rocket exploded shortly after launch in 1960. Dozens of dogs flew on these missions over the years, each one contributing data, each one helping scientists understand what spaceflight did to living bodies, each one bringing the dream of human spaceflight one step closer to reality. These flights tested survival limits. They pushed dogs to the edge of what living beings could endure. The acceleration of launch could reach 5 or 6 Gs, 5 or 6 times normal gravity. Imagine your body suddenly weighing 5 times what it normally does. The pressure, the difficulty breathing, the strain on your heart. The dogs experienced this, strapped into their capsules, unable to understand what was happening. Then, suddenly, weightlessness. The strange sensation of floating, of nothing solid beneath you, of your stomach rising into your throat. The dogs floated in their harnesses for minutes at a time while the rocket arced through space. Then re-entry, falling back towards Earth, the capsule heating up as it slammed into the thickening atmosphere. More G-forces, more crushing pressure, the screaming sound of air rushing past, the violent shaking and vibration. And finally, if everything worked, the parachute would deploy. The capsule would drift down, impact would come, hard but survivable. And the dogs, if they were lucky, would be recovered, examined, studied, rested, and eventually, perhaps, sent up again. This was the program Laika's mission built upon. Years of earlier animal experimentation, years of learning what worked and what didn't, years of incremental progress paid for in canine lives towards the goal of human spaceflight. The scientists weren't monsters. Most of them loved dogs. Many kept the dogs they worked with as pets after their missions were complete. They understood that what they were doing was ethically complicated, that they were using animals who couldn't consent, that some of these dogs would die. But they justified it. They told themselves it was necessary, that human knowledge required sacrifice, that the dog's contribution would help future cosmonauts survive, that one day humans would walk in space, land on the moon, explore the cosmos, and the dogs would have helped make that possible. Whether this justification was adequate is something each person must decide for themselves. History gives us facts. Ethics requires us to reckon with those facts according to our own values. What we can say is this: Laika was not an isolated sacrifice. She was part of a larger program, a program that had been sending dogs towards space for years, a program that had learned through trial and error, through success and failure, how to keep a dog alive during a space flight. The tragedy of Laika's mission is that all that knowledge, all those years of experience, all those hard-won lessons about keeping dogs safe, they weren't enough. Because Laika's mission was different. It wasn't suborbital. It was orbital. It would last days, not minutes. And the deadline was so compressed that corners were cut. Systems that should have been tested thoroughly were rushed into use. Problems that should have been solved weren't. Laika's mission, built on years of earlier work, but it also departed from that work in crucial ways. Ways that would have fatal consequences. Now we come to the part of the story that's hardest to tell. The part about how Laika was prepared for her mission. How her world grew smaller and smaller. How her life became a series of tests and trials and adaptations. How she was systematically trained for something no dog could truly understand. Take a deep breath. Let any stress or tension release. This section isn't graphic, but it is sad. It's the slow narrowing of a life. The systematic removal of everything normal and comfortable, all in service of a goal that Laika herself could never comprehend. Laika was selected for specific reasons. Her size. She weighed only about 13 pounds. She needed to be small to fit in the cramped capsule. Her temperament, calm, not easily startled, tolerant of handling. Her health, street tough, resilient, no obvious medical problems. And that ineffable quality the scientists had noticed, her acceptance. Her ability to endure what was asked of her. There were other candidates, other small dogs, other strays, but Laika rose to the top of the selection process. She was the one who best met all the criteria. She was the one who would fly. The training began immediately, because with only a month to prepare, there was no time to waste. The first challenge was confinement. The capsule Laika would ride in was tiny, impossibly small by human standards. Just large enough for a small dog to sit or lie down, but not to stand fully or turn around. The scientists needed to know if dogs could survive in such confined conditions for the days the mission was expected to last. So Laika was confined, in progressively smaller cages, for longer and longer periods, up to 20 days at a time, in cages barely larger than her body. Think about that, 20 days, unable to stand, unable to stretch, unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. For a creature whose nature is to move, to explore, to be active, 20 days of forced stillness. The dogs initially showed distress. Of course they did. They would refuse to eat. They would refuse to eliminate, holding it despite obvious discomfort because their instincts told them not to soil their sleeping area. Their physical condition would decline, weight loss, lethargy, signs of depression. But over time, a terrible concept, over time, they adapted. They learned to eat in confinement. They learned to eliminate in the special collection systems. They learned to exist in these impossibly small spaces. Their bodies and minds adjusted to circumstances that were profoundly abnormal. This was considered success. This was the goal, to break down the dog's natural responses and rebuild their behaviour around the requirements of the mission. Other training follows. Centrifuge tests. The dogs were strapped into a capsule mounted on a spinning arm. The centrifuge would whirl them around faster and faster, simulating the G-forces of launch. 5 Gs, 6 Gs, the crushing pressure that would pin them against their seats during the ascent. The scientists needed to know if the dogs' hearts could handle it, if their bodies would survive. Most did survive. Their hearts, strengthened by the hard life of the streets, proved resilient. Their compact bodies handled the forces better than larger animals might have, but the experience was terrifying. No matter how many times they went through it, dogs never stopped showing signs of fear before centrifuge tests. They knew what was coming, they remembered. Then there was noise training. Space launches are phenomenally loud. The roar of rocket engines can damage hearing, can cause physical pain, can trigger panic. The dogs were exposed to recordings of rocket noise, loud, louder, louder still, habituating them to sounds that would have sent any normal dog running in terror. They were trained to eat gel food, a specially formulated, high-calorie nutritional paste that could be dispensed in weightless conditions. They were trained to tolerate harnesses and sensor arrays taped to their bodies. They were trained to accept the waste collection system that would catch their urine and feces during flight. They were trained to stay calm while technicians poked and prodded and measured and recorded. Every aspect of their natural behaviour was examined and, where necessary, modified. Every comfort removed, every freedom constrained, all to prepare them for a mission that would take them further from their natural state than any dog had ever gone. Laika endured all of this. She was, by all accounts, an exemplary subject, calm, cooperative, accepting. The scientists grew fond of her. Several would later write about feeling affection for her, about hating what they were putting her through, about wishing there was another way. But there wasn't another way, not in the time they had, not with the pressure they were under, not with the world they inhabited. So the training continued, day after day, week after week, as the deadline approached, as Sputnik 2 took shape in the workshops, as the rocket was prepared on the launch pad, and Laika, small and calm and unknowing, prepared to become the most famous dog in history, prepared to go where no living creature had gone before, prepared, though she could not know it, for a journey she would not survive. Let this settle. This is the foundation of what comes next. The preparation, the narrowing, the systemic transformation of a street dog into a passenger for an impossible journey. We're not done with Laika's story. There's more to come. For now, we'll rest here with this small dog, in her training, in her weeks before she became famous, in the last days when she was still just Laika, a stray from Moscow, living her strange new life in cages and laboratories and training facilities. Still alive, still breathing, still existing moment to moment, as dogs do, not knowing what was coming, not able to know, just a small dog being prepared for a very big moment. Before we go further, before we follow Laika into space, there's something you need to know, something that colours everything that comes after, something that was known from the very beginning. Sputnik 2 was explicitly a one-way mission. There was no plan to bring Laika home, no recovery system, no safe landing. From the moment the mission was conceived, everyone involved knew this truth. There was no technology to deorbit or recover a spacecraft, not in 1957, not with the deadline they were working under, not with the resources available. The Soviets had rockets that could reach orbit. They had capsules that could sustain life, at least temporarily. But bringing something safely back from orbit, that was a much harder problem. A problem that would take more time to solve. More time than Khrushchev was willing to give them. Soviet planners knew that Laika would not return alive. This wasn't a secret. It wasn't hidden from the scientists working on the project. They knew, they discussed it, they wrestled with it. Some objected, some argued for waiting, for taking more time to develop recovery systems. But in the end, the decision was made. The mission would proceed. The anniversary deadline was absolute, and Laika would go, knowing she, or rather the humans who sent her, would never bring her home. In the days before launch, Laika was sealed into the capsule, not at the last minute, but days in advance. She spent her final days on Earth already confined in a tiny space where she would ride into orbit, already isolated, already past the point of no return, even before the rocket fired. She had very limited movement. The capsule was so small, just enough room to sit or lie down. The padding around her, the sensors taped to her body, the harness holding her in place, the feeding system, the waste collection system, all of it tested one final time with Laika inside. Because once the capsule was sealed and mounted on the rocket, there would be no way to make adjustments. Think about those days. Laika in her capsule, technicians checking systems around her, the sound of the launch facility, the knowledge, though only the humans had this knowledge, that in a few days she would be gone, up beyond the atmosphere, circling the Earth, alone in the black. The scientists who worked with her came to say goodbye. Some brought treats, though she couldn't eat them through the capsule's sealed system. Some spoke to her, some simply stood nearby, witnessing, bearing witness to what was about to happen, to what they were part of. One scientist, Oleg Gazenko, who trained many of the Soviet space dogs, would later say that he wished he could ask Laika for forgiveness, that he regretted not standing up more firmly against the mission, that no amount of data was worth what they were about to do. But that's looking backward. That's hindsight and regret. In those final days before launch, the mission went forward. Systems were checked, fuel was loaded, the rocket stood ready, and Laika waited in her capsule, unaware that she was about to make history, unaware that millions of people would soon know her name, unaware of what the next hours would bring. This is important to understand, not to make the story more tragic. It's already tragic enough, but to properly frame what comes next. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an unexpected failure. The one-way nature of the mission was built in from the start. It was a choice, a deliberate choice made by humans for reasons that had nothing to do with Laika's well-being. History asks us to witness this choice, to understand it in context. The Cold War, the space race, the pressure, the deadline, but also to reckon with it, to hold it up and examine it and decide what it means for how we conduct ourselves, how to treat the beings we have power over, how we balance progress against ethics. This is the threshold, the moment before everything changes. Laika is sealed in her capsule. The rocket is ready. The mission that cannot return is about to begin. November 3rd, 1957. Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan. Early morning, cold. The sun not yet risen. Frost on the launch pad. Technicians in heavy coats moving through final checks. And inside the capsule, at the top of the rocket, Laika waits. The countdown proceeds. In Russian. Numbers ticking down towards zero. Towards ignition. Towards the moment that everything changes. The final seconds. 10, 9, 8. The world holding its breath. Though most of the world doesn't know what's about to happen. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. The rocket engines light. A roar that drowns out everything else. A roar that shakes the ground, that rattles buildings kilometers away. A roar that Laika can hear even through the insulated capsule. Even with all the preparations and noise training, nothing can truly prepare a living creature for this sound, this violence, this sudden transformation of the world. The rocket lifts. slowly at first, then faster, accelerating, climbing on a pillar of fire and smoke, the G-forces building, 2 Gs, 3 Gs, 4 Gs. Laika pressed into her padding, her body suddenly so heavy. Breathing is difficult, her heart is pounding, the telemetry systems recording everything, every heartbeat, every breath, sending the data down to the ground stations, to the scientists watching, waiting, hoping their systems will work, hoping she'll survive the launch. Her heart rate more than doubled during launch, from a resting rate of around 100 beats per minute to over 200. This is stress. This is fear. The body's emergency response to an overwhelming situation. The dogs had been trained for this, had experienced it in the centrifuge, but this was different. This was real. This was the full fury of a rocket launch. And somewhere in Laika's mind, on some level, she must have known this wasn't training. This was something else, something unprecedented. The telemetry showed prolonged extreme stress, not just during the initial acceleration, but continuing as the rocket climbed through the atmosphere, as the pressure changed, as the noise and vibration continued minute after minute. Every sensor on Laika's body reporting the same story: extreme physiological stress. And then, about 10 minutes after launch, the rocket engines cut off. The violent shaking stopped. The crushing G-forces disappeared. Suddenly, impossibly, there was no weight at all. Zero gravity. Weightlessness. Laika floating in her harness, held in place only by the straps. The strangest sensation for any creature evolved under Earth's gravity. No up, no down, just floating in the dark. At that moment, Laika became the first living creature to orbit Earth. Not the first in space, as we said. Other animals had reached space briefly on suborbital flights, but the first to achieve orbit, the first to circle the planet, the first to remain in space not for minutes, but for what would be hours, days even, if the mission went to plan. From the ground they tracked her orbit, they calculated her path. Sputnik 2 was circling the Earth every hour and 42 minutes, an elliptical orbit, coming as close as 211 kilometers and ranging out as far as 1,660 kilometers from Earth's surface. Laika was up there, higher than any living thing had ever been, higher than the atmosphere, in the realm of vacuum and radiation and stars. The moment was historic, undeniably historic. In laboratories around the world, scientists followed the news with awe. A dog was orbiting Earth. A living creature was surviving in space. The implications were enormous. If a dog could survive launch and orbit, then humans could too. The path to human spaceflight had been opened. But mixed with the awe was something else. Unease, because everyone who knew anything about the mission knew the truth, knew this dog wasn't coming back, that history was being made, but at a cost that many people, even in that moment of triumph, weren't sure was justified. Laika couldn't know any of this, couldn't know she'd made history, couldn't know her name was already spreading around the world, couldn't know that she represented both humanity's greatest achievement in space exploration so far and a moral question that would echo for decades. She could only experience the moment, the weightlessness, the strange silence after the roar of launch, the unfamiliar sensations, her body trying to adjust to conditions it had never encountered before, her heart slowly, gradually, beginning to come down from its stressed peak, still elevated, still showing the strain, but not quite as frantic as during launch, and the systems around her were working, for now. The oxygen generator functioned, the carbon dioxide scrubbers absorbing the gas she exhaled, the temperature control trying to maintain a survivable environment, the telemetry transmitting data during brief windows when Sputnik 2 passed over Soviet ground stations. Everything seemed to be functioning. The mission seemed to be succeeding. Laika was alive. She was in orbit. The anniversary celebration could proceed. Khrushchev could declare victory. The Soviet Union had, once again, demonstrated its superiority in space. But what the telemetry couldn't fully convey, what the numbers couldn't completely capture, was what it meant to Laika in that moment, alone, confused, stressed beyond anything her training had prepared her for, unable to understand where she was, or why, or what was happening. Just a small dog in an impossibly strange situation, making history whether she wanted to or not, living through something no living creature had experienced before, one small heartbeat in the vast darkness of space. Let's look at what the scientists were monitoring, what they were measuring as Laika circled the Earth, because understanding the data helps us understand what happened next. Sensors recorded her heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, and movement. These were the key vital signs, the data that would tell the scientists whether Laika was surviving, whether life support systems were adequate, whether a living creature could function in an environment of space. The data was transmitted during short radio windows over Soviet ground stations. Sputnik 2 was constantly orbiting, but it could only send data when it passed over facilities equipped to receive the signals. These windows were brief, minutes at a time. Then Laika would pass out of range, over oceans or foreign territories, and the scientists would lose contact, waiting, hoping, until the next pass brought her back within range and they could receive more telemetry. Inside the capsule, the life support system worked to keep Laika alive. An oxygen generator to replace the oxygen she breathed, canisters of chemicals that absorbed the carbon dioxide she exhaled, because in a sealed capsule, CO2 buildup would quickly become lethal, and a cooling fan to circulate air and regulate temperature. The last system, the cooling system, was crucial. Laika's body generated heat. The electronics in the capsule generated heat. The sun, when Sputnik 2 was on the daylight side of its orbit, heated the capsule from the outside. Without adequate cooling, the temperature would rise, and become dangerous. The gel food system was there, ready to dispense nutrition if Laika would eat. The waste systems ready to collect urine and feces. All of this tested basic biological function in orbit. Can a dog eat in weightlessness? Can digestive and urinary systems function normally? These were questions that needed answers before humans could fly. For the first few orbits, the data looked relatively good. Laika's heart rate was elevated, but not dangerously so. She was breathing, moving occasionally. The capsule systems seemed to be working. The mission was being declared a success. News of the launch spread around the world, radio broadcasts, newspaper headlines. Sputnik 2 was in orbit with a dog on board. The Soviet Union had done it again, even more impressive than Sputnik 1. This was life in space. This was the future arriving. But in the control rooms, as the orbits continued, some of the scientists were beginning to see things in the data that concerned them. The temperature readings from inside the capsule, they were higher than expected, higher than the models had predicted, and slowly, gradually, they were rising. The cooling fan was running, the air circulation system was functioning, but it wasn't enough. Something was wrong with the thermal control. Maybe insulation had been damaged during launch. Maybe the design was flawed. Maybe the rushed timeline hadn't allowed for adequate testing. Whatever the reason, heat was building up inside the capsule, and there was nothing they could do about it. No way to adjust the cooling system from the ground. No way to open vents or change the configuration. The capsule was sealed, autonomous. Whatever was going to happen would happen, and all they could do was watch the telemetry and know that something was going wrong, know that the temperature was rising, know that Laika was up there, alone, in a capsule that was slowly becoming too hot, and know that there was nothing, absolutely nothing, they could do to help her. This is what the data showed. This is what the scientists watching the telemetry came to understand during those first hours of the mission, that their calculations had been wrong, that the systems they'd designed in such haste weren't adequate, that the mission was failing in a way they hadn't anticipated. And somewhere above them, orbiting silently through space, Laika was experiencing what the numbers on their screens represented. Heat, stress, her body struggling to cope with conditions that were moving beyond survivable. Now we come to the part of the story that was hidden for decades, the part that the Soviet Union didn't want the world to know, the truth about what happened to Laika in those first hours of orbit. A failure in thermal control caused the cabin temperature to rise dangerously. We know this now from post-Soviet disclosures, from scientists who worked on the program finally being able to speak openly, from records that were kept secret for decades, but eventually became public. The temperature inside the capsule climbed, past 30 degrees Celsius, past 35, past 40. These are temperatures that a dog cannot survive for long, especially a dog already stressed, already pushed to her physiological limits by launch and weightlessness and confinement. Laika died within 5 to 7 hours from overheating and stress. Not days, not the week the Soviets initially claimed, but hours. She may have completed 4 orbits, maybe 5, and then her heart stopped. The telemetry went quiet. The vital signs flatlined. And the scientists watching the data knew what had happened, knew that Laika was gone, that the mission had failed in the worst possible way, that the dog they'd trained and prepared and worried about was dead, floating in her capsule, circling a planet she would never return to. But this truth was not shared. For decades, the USSR claimed she survived several days, that she'd lived for almost a week in orbit before the air ran out as planned, that she'd died peacefully when the life support was deliberately shut down. This was the official story, the story told to the public, to the press, to the world. Some people suspected otherwise. The brief nature of the telemetry transmissions, the way Soviet statements about the mission were worded, but without proof, without official confirmation, the lie held. It wasn't until the early 2000s, more than 40 years after Laika's death, that the truth was finally confirmed publicly. Post-Soviet disclosures, scientists who'd worked on the program coming forward with the real data. The rapid overheating scenario, the death within hours, the decades of deception. Oleg Gazenko, one of the leading scientists in the Soviet space dog program, spoke publicly about his regrets. He said the mission was not justified by the data gained, that nothing they learnt from Laika's death couldn't have been learned another way, with more time, with better systems, with missions designed for recovery. He said he wished he could apologise to Laika, that he carried guilt for what they'd done. Other scientists expressed similar regrets. Not all. Some maintained that the mission was necessary, that the data was valuable, that progress requires sacrifice. But many, especially as they grew older and could look back with the perspective of decades, acknowledged that the mission was rushed, poorly planned, and shouldn't have proceeded in the way it did. This is the truth we're left with. Laika didn't die after days in orbit. She died within hours. The mission that was supposed to demonstrate Soviet superiority in space became, instead, a demonstration of what happens when political deadlines override ethical considerations, when the rush to be the first overwhelms the responsibility to be careful. We tell this truth not to condemn, not to point fingers across the years at people who made difficult decisions under circumstances we can barely imagine, but to witness, to acknowledge what happened, to hold space for the reality of Laika's experience, brief as it was in orbit. She was scared, she was stressed, she overheated and died alone in the dark, far from Earth, unable to understand what was happening to her. This is sad. This is difficult. This is the truth that should make us uncomfortable. That's appropriate. Some truth should make us uncomfortable, but we don't need to dwell in the mechanics of her suffering. We don't need to imagine the details. It's enough to know that it happened, that she died too soon, that the mission failed her, that humans made choices that led to her death in a way that wasn't necessary, that wasn't justified, and wasn't right. Hold this truth gently. Don't let it overwhelm you. Just acknowledge it. Bear witness to it, and then we'll look at what came after, at how the world responded, at what changed because of Laika's sacrifice. Because the story doesn't end with her death. In many ways, that's where the most important part of the story begins. The news of Laika's launch spread quickly around the world. Within hours, newspapers were printing special editions. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming. This was news that captured imaginations everywhere. A dog in space, orbiting Earth. It was simultaneously wonderful and terrible, amazing and disturbing. Western media dubbed the satellite Mutnik, a play on Sputnik, mixing in the colloquial term for a mixed-breed dog. The nickname was affectionate perhaps, but also carried an edge of mockery. The mighty Soviet space program reduced to sending mutts into space. Initial coverage focused on the technological achievement. This was impressive, undeniably. If the Soviets could launch a living creature and keep it alive in orbit, they were ahead in the space race. The implications for future human spaceflight were obvious. This was the story that dominated the first news cycles. But as more details emerged, or rather, as the lack of certain details became apparent, the tone of coverage began to shift. People asked, "How is the dog coming back? When will they recover her?" And gradually, reluctantly, the truth became known. She's not coming back. This is a one-way mission. Laika is going to die up there. As the one-way nature became clear, outrage grew, first in the West, where criticism of Soviet actions was politically acceptable, but then more widely, people who had initially been impressed by the achievement now felt something else: anger, sadness. a sense that something had gone terribly wrong, that a line had been crossed. Protests occurred in the UK, the USA, and elsewhere. These weren't massive political demonstrations, but they were real. They were visible, organised by animal welfare groups, by pet owners, by people who felt that what had been done to Laika was wrong and that someone needed to say so. Dog owners marched with protest signs attached to their pets, simple signs: "Save Laika," "Bring her home," "A dog's life matters." The image of dogs carrying signs, protesting the treatment of another dog, had a poignancy that resonated. These were people who loved their own dogs, looking at Laika and seeing not a Soviet experiment, but a fellow creature, someone's potential pet, a dog who deserved better. The RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in Britain, and other groups, called for protests at Soviet embassies. They wrote letters, made statements, demanded that future missions not use animals in this way, that if space exploration required sacrifice, it should at least include a plan for recovery, that lives shouldn't be thrown away simply to meet political deadlines. British newspapers ran emotional poems about Laika, anthropomorphic stories, imagining what she might have been thinking, feeling, experiencing up there in orbit. These pieces were sentimental, certainly. They projected human emotions onto a dog who likely experienced things very differently. But they served a purpose. They made people feel, made them connect emotionally with what had happened, made Laika more than just a data point in a space race. In the United States, where anti-Soviet sentiment was strong, Laika became a propaganda tool. Look at what the communists do. Look at how they treat living beings. This is their system, cruel, ruthless, willing to sacrifice anything for political gain. The message was clear. We wouldn't do this. American democracy is more humane, more ethical, better. Of course, this was somewhat hypocritical. The American space program was also using animals, monkeys primarily, and while American missions were designed with recovery in mind, they weren't always successful. Animals died in American space tests too, but Laika's case was different because of the deliberate one-way nature, because everyone knew from the start she would not return. That made it easier to condemn. Around the world, people who had never particularly thought about space exploration or animal testing suddenly had opinions. School children wrote letters. Adults discussed it over dinner. It became a cultural moment, a conversation, a global reckoning with the question, what are we willing to do in the name of progress? Laika had become more than a dog. She'd become a symbol, a representative of all the animals used in research, a test case for how humanity would handle the ethics of space exploration, a mirror reflecting back our priorities, our values, our willingness or unwillingness to sacrifice others for our goals. The Soviet Union, for its part, responded defensively. They portrayed Laika as a heroic martyr, a dog who'd sacrificed herself for the advancement of science, for the glory of the Soviet state, for the future of humanity in space. This was the official narrative. This was how Soviet citizens were encouraged to view the mission, and many did view it that way. In a society where individual sacrifice for the collective good was a central value, where the state's goals were meant to take precedence over personal concerns, Laika's mission fit an existing framework. She was a hero. Her death was tragic, but meaningful. She'd contributed to something larger than herself. But even in the Soviet Union, not everyone was comfortable with what had happened. Though open criticism was dangerous, Though the official narrative dominated public discourse, there were people who privately questioned whether the mission had been right, whether they'd moved too fast, whether one dog's life had been worth it. The world's reaction to Laika was complex, mixed, coloured by politics and propaganda and personal values. But underneath all the complexity was a simple emotional truth. People cared about what had happened to her. They felt it was wrong, even if they couldn't always articulate why, even if they understood the scientific justification, even if they recognised the historical significance. A small dog had touched something in the human conscience, had raised questions we are still working to answer, about progress and cost, about what we owe to beings in our power, about how far is too far, about who gets to decide when a sacrifice is justified. While the world protested, inside the Soviet Union there was mostly silence. Not complete silence. The mission was celebrated after all, but critical silence. The kind of silence that comes when speaking certain truths is dangerous. Soviet media portrayed Laika as a heroic martyr, as we've discussed. She was featured in children's books, commemorated in stamps and posters, held up as an example of sacrifice for the greater good. The narrative was controlled, positive, carefully curated to serve the state's purpose. Open criticism was absent at the time. This wasn't surprising. In the Soviet systems of 1957, you didn't publicly question major state projects. You didn't criticize missions that had been personally ordered by Khrushchev. You didn't express doubts about whether the advancement of Soviet science justified the methods used to achieve it. So the Soviet scientists who worked on the program, who had trained Laika, who had watched her die hours into the mission, they stayed quiet. They did their work. They analysed the data. They planned future missions. And they kept their doubts, if they had any, private. But time changes things, systems change, and eventually people who've had to keep secrets find opportunities to speak. Decades later, scientists like Oleg Gazenko expressed regret. He stated publicly that the mission was not justified by the data gained, that they could have learned the same things with more time, better planning, missions designed for recovery, that nothing they learned from Laika's death couldn't have been learned another way. He said he wanted to ask Laika for forgiveness. These are remarkable words from a scientist, from someone trained to think in terms of data and results and advancement of knowledge, to acknowledge that the cost had been too high, that some prices should not be paid, no matter what you gain in return. Other scientists from the program have made similar statements over the years. Not all. Some still defend the mission, still argue it was necessary, still maintain that the knowledge gained justified the cost. But many, especially in their later years, have expressed some form of regret, some acknowledgement that they wish things had been different. This adds maturity to the story, reflection, the kind of wisdom that can only come with time and distance. These weren't monsters who sent Laika up. They were humans, working under extreme pressure, making decisions in a system that didn't always allow for ethical deliberation, operating in a time when attitudes about animal testing were different than they are now. And with time, with the pressure off, with the ability to look back and assess, many of them acknowledged that mistakes were made, that they moved too fast, that Laika's mission shouldn't have proceeded in the way it did. This doesn't undo what happened. Regret doesn't bring Laika back, but it matters. It matters that the people involved were capable of reflection, of reassessment, of acknowledging that they could have done better. It's a reminder that ethical progress is possible, that people can learn, that systems can change, slowly, not without cost, not without harm along the way, but change is possible. The silence at the time and the regret expressed later are both part of Laika's story. Both tell us something about humans, about how we make decisions under pressure, about how we justify our choices in the moment, and about how, with time and distance, we can sometimes see those choices differently. So what came of Laika's mission? What changed because of her sacrifice? Because if we're going to witness this difficult history, we should also acknowledge its consequences. The ways in which Laika's death, somehow, however unjust, did lead to change. Later dog missions were designed for recovery. This was the most direct and immediate consequence. The outcry over Laika, combined with the technical lessons learned from her mission, pushed the Soviet space program to develop recovery systems, to figure out how to bring living creatures back from orbit safely. In 1960, just 3 years after Laika, Belka and Strelka went to space, 2 dogs, and unlike Laika, they were designed to come home, and they did. The mission was a success. The dogs returned safely, becoming the first living creatures to survive a trip to orbit and back. They lived out their lives as celebrities. Strelka even had puppies later, one of which was given to President Kennedy's children. More dogs followed. Some missions succeeded, some failed. Space is unforgiving, and not every mission goes as planned. But the key difference was that failure was no longer built into the design. The goal was always to bring the animals home safely, and increasingly that goal was achieved. Laika influenced ethical debates on animal testing in space. Her mission became a reference point, a line in the sand. Animal welfare groups and ethics could point to Laika and say, "This is what happens when we move too fast." Her mission became a reference point, a line in the sand. Animal welfare groups and ethicists could point to Laika and say, "This is what happens when we move too fast, when we prioritize achievement over ethics, when we don't properly weigh the cost of what we're doing." These debates didn't stop animal testing. Animals continued to be used in space research for many years. But the conversations became more serious. The protocols became more stringent. The consideration of alternatives became more systematic. Laika's death made it harder to simply assume that any experiment was justified. It forced people to think more carefully about what they were doing and why. In the longer term, as technology improved and simulation capabilities increased, the need for animal testing in space decreased. Not because of any singular factor, including Laika, but because of a gradual shift in capabilities and attitudes. But Laika's mission was part of that shift, part of the pressure that eventually led to change. She is commemorated in monuments and art. In Moscow, there's a monument to Laika, showing her standing on a rocket, looking upward. The sculpture is small, like she was small. It's dignified, a memorial to what she endured. Artists have depicted her in paintings, murals, songs, poems. She appears in discussions of space history, animal rights, Cold War politics. She's been the subject of children's books that try to explain her story in age-appropriate ways. She's remembered. This matters. Commemoration matters. It's a way of saying this happened. This life mattered. We witnessed it. We're not going to forget. And Sputnik 2 itself, it remained in orbit for 162 days, more than 5 months. Long after Laika died, her capsule continued to circle Earth. Thousands of orbits, passing over the planet again and again, a tiny metal tomb carrying one small body. Eventually, on April 14th, 1958, Sputnik 2's orbit decayed enough that it re-entered Earth's atmosphere. It burned up, disintegrated, scattered across the sky in a brief bright streak that most people never noticed. Laika's final journey ended not with a landing, but with fire, with a return to the atmosphere she'd launched from, in a form that no longer resembled a dog or a capsule or anything recognizable. What Laika changed is hard to quantify completely. Some changes were direct and measurable, better recovery systems, better protocols. Some were subtler, shifts in public opinions, changes in how scientists thought about their work, contributions to a larger cultural conversation about progress and ethics. But this much we can say with certainty. Her mission made people think, made them question, made them consider costs they may have otherwise ignored, made one small dog into a symbol that would echo through decades of space exploration and ethical debate. Was it worth it? That's not a question for history to answer. That's a question each person has to answer for themselves. Was the knowledge gained, the changes that followed, the conversations that began, was all of that worth Laika's fear and suffering and death? There's no objectively correct answer, only the answer each of us comes to when we sit with the question honestly. What we can say is this: people learned, slowly, not without cost, but they learned. The line that Laika's mission represented, the line of how far we're willing to go in the name of progress, that line shifted. Not far enough for everyone, too far for some, but it shifted. And Laika, the small stray from Moscow, the dog who never chose any of this, became part of the story of how humanity learns to be more careful, more ethical, more considerate of the beings we have power over. That's not nothing. It doesn't justify what happened to her, but it means her suffering wasn't completely meaningless, that something came of it, that she's remembered, not just for what was done to her, but for what changed because of her. Breathe slowly. Let your body settle. We're going to step back from the difficult part of this story, step back from space and politics and tragedy. We're going to find a quieter moment, a gentler moment, a moment that actually happened, though the world didn't know about it for many years. This is the story of Laika's last gift, a gift given by a man who knew what was coming and wanted to do something kind. It was late in October 1957, just days before the launch. The training was complete. The capsule was being prepared. The rocket stood ready at Baikonur. Everything was proceeding according to schedule. Everything was in place for the mission that would make history. Dr. Vladimir Yadovsky stood in the training facility, looking at Laika in her kennel. He was one of the lead scientists of the program, one of the people responsible for training the space dogs. He worked with Laika for weeks now. He observed her calm temperament, had noted her intelligence, had watched her adapt to each new challenge they'd placed before her. He knew what was coming. He knew the mission parameters, knew that in just a few days, Laika would be sealed into the capsule and launched into orbit. He knew she wouldn't be coming back. The knowledge sat heavily on him. This was his work, his responsibility, his contribution to Soviet science and the space program. He believed in the mission's importance, understood the need for the data they would gather, accepted that this was how progress happened. But Laika was more than data to him, more than a test subject. She was a living being, a dog with her own personality, her own way of moving through the world. Quiet and charming, he would later write. Those were the words he used. Quiet and charming. He made a decision, one that wasn't in any protocol, one he didn't ask permission for because he knew what the answer would be, one that was simply an act of kindness from one being to another. He would take Laika home, just for an evening, just for a little while, so she could experience something normal, something good, something that had nothing to do with training or confinement or preparation for a mission she couldn't understand, because she had so little time left. He opened her kennel. "Come on, Zhushka," he said softly in Russian. "We're going somewhere different today." Laika emerged, as she always did, calmly, waiting to see what would be asked of her. But instead of leading her to a training room or examination area, Yozdovsky walked towards the facility's exit, towards the outside, towards his parked car in the lot. The evening air was cool. Moscow in late October carried the bite of approaching winter. But after the recycled air of the facility, it was fresh and clean, carrying the scents of the city, cooking smells, car exhaust, the particular mix of urban life. Yudovsky's car was modest, a simple Soviet vehicle. He opened the passenger door, and Laika jumped in without hesitation. She'd been in vehicles before, during transport between facilities. This was familiar enough not to cause concern. But the drive was different. Yudovsky didn't drive toward another facility or laboratory. He drove through Moscow's streets towards the residential district, towards home, towards his apartment where his wife and children waited. The city passed by the windows like a watched as dogs do, taking in the movement and lights and activity. The streets were busy with people heading home from work, with trams clattering along their routes, with the everyday bustle of a major city in the evening. Yudovsky parked outside an apartment building, ordinary, concrete, like thousands of others in Moscow. He led Laika inside, up the stairs to the third floor. The hallway smelled like cooking, dozens of families preparing their evening meals. Cabbage, potatoes, meat when families could afford it. The warm, lived-in smell of home. He opened his apartment door, and Laika heard them before she saw them. Children. The sound of children's voices, high and bright and full of energy, so different from the controlled, measured tones of the scientists at the facility. 2 children came running to the door, a boy and a girl, perhaps 8 and 6 years old. They stopped when they saw the dog, their eyes going wide with delight. "Papa brought a dog," the girl exclaimed. "Can we pet her?" the boy asked, already reaching out. "Gently," Yudovsky said. "Her name is Laika. She's been working very hard, and she's here to rest for the evening. Can you be gentle with her?" The children nodded solemnly, understanding that this was important. They approached slowly, hands out for Laika to sniff. She'd had limited experience with children. The training facility was an adult world of scientists and technicians, but something in her seemed to recognize that these small humans meant no harm. The girl's hand touched Laika's head, soft, tentative. "She's so soft," she whispered. The boy stroked her back. "Why is she here, Papa?" Yudovsky's wife appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at her husband, a question in her eyes. He met her gaze and something passed between them, an understanding. She knew what he did, knew about the space program, though not all the details, but she knew about the mission coming up, and she knew what it meant. She nodded slightly. "Well," she said to the children, "if Laika is our guest for the evening, we should make her comfortable. Have you shown her the apartment yet?" The children's faces lit up. "Can she see our room?" the girl asked. "I think she'd like that," their mother said. And so began Laika's tour of a normal home, led by two excited children who wanted to show her everything, who took her small presence as a wonderful gift, who had no idea that this dog was about to make history, who just saw a friendly dog who needed attention and care. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living area, simple furniture, some books, toys scattered in the children's room, the everyday accumulation of a family's life. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary, just home. But for Laika, it was different from anything she'd experienced in months. Different from the facility, different from the kennels, even different in some ways from her life on the streets. This was warmth and comfort and the particular energy of a family living their ordinary life. The children showed her their room. The boy had a collection of small wooden toys, cars and animals carved from wood. The girl had a doll with a cloth dress their mother had sewn. They sat on the floor with Laika, showing her these treasures as if she could understand their importance. Laika settled between them. The floor was hard, but there was a rug, worn thin from years of use, but still providing some cushion. The children's hands were constant on her, petting, stroking, gentle in the way children can be when they've been taught to be careful with animals. "She's so calm," the boy observed. "Not like the dog at school that barks all the time." "Papa said she's been working hard," the girl reminded him. "Maybe she's tired." They weren't wrong. Laika was tired. Weeks of training, weeks of tests and confinement and constant evaluation. But this was a different kind of tired, a settled tired, a tired that came with permission to rest. From the kitchen came the sound of smells of dinner being prepared, simple food, the same food the family ate every day. But the smells were rich and warm, onions cooking, bread, soup simmering on the stove. Yadovsky sat in the living area, watching his children with Laika. His wife came to stand beside him. "How long does she have?" she asked quietly. 3 days, he answered. "The launch is scheduled for November the 3rd. A silence. Then, "I'm glad you brought her home. She deserves something normal," he said. "Something that wasn't about the mission, even if it's just for one evening." His wife touched his shoulder briefly, then returned to the kitchen. Yadovsky continued to watch. His daughter had found a soft brush and was carefully brushing Laika's coat. The dog's eyes were half closed, her body relaxed. The boy was talking to her in a continuous stream, telling her about his day at school, about his friend Victor, about the bird he'd seen on the walk home. Laika didn't understand these words, but she understood the tone, kind, gentle, inclusive. She was being treated not as a test subject, but as a guest, as someone worthy of attention and care simply for existing. Dinner was ready. The family gathered at the small table in the kitchen. There wasn't room for Laika at the table, so the children made her a special spot beside it. The girl fetched a cushion from the couch, the good cushion, the soft one, and placed it on the floor. "For Laika," she announced, "so she's comfortable." Laika settled onto the cushion. It was softer than anything in the facility, softer than the padding in her training cage. It smelt like family, like children and their parents, like this home. She curled into it, her body sinking into the unexpected comfort. The family ate. Simple conversation. The children talking about school, Yostovsky's wife mentioning their neighbour. Ordinary family talk. But occasionally the children would sneak glances at Laika, would reach down to touch her, checking that she was still there, still real, still their guest. After dinner, the boy carefully brought a small piece of bread to Laika. "Can she have this?" he asked his father. Yostovsky nodded. The gel food at the facility was nutritionally complete, but joyless. A small piece of bread wouldn't hurt, might even be kind. The boy offered the bread to Laika. She took it gently from his small fingers, her teeth never touching his skin. She ate it slowly. The bread was slightly stale, a day old perhaps, but it was real food, food made for humans and shared with her. That made it special. "She likes it," the boy said delightedly. As evening deepened into night, the children's energy began to fade. Their mother announced bedtime, which was met with the usual protests. But tonight the protests were half-hearted. They were tired, and they knew Laika was still there, would still be there in the morning, or so they hoped. "Can Laika sleep in our room?" the girl asked. Yostovsky looked at Laika, looked at his children's hopeful faces. "If she wants to," he said, "but we don't force her. She chooses." The children got ready for bed, teeth brushed, pajamas on, then they climbed into their beds, small beds on opposite walls of their room. The light was turned off, leaving only the glow from the hallway. And Laika chose. She walked into the children's room and settled on the floor between the two beds, close enough to both children that they could reach down and touch her if they wanted. A guardian's position, a protective position, something instinctual in her, even after all the training and even after all the changes. "Good night, Laika," the girl whispered from her bed. "Good night," the boy echoed. Laika didn't respond, of course, but she stayed, settled, comfortable on the floor of this small room with these small humans who had been nothing but kind to her. The children's breathing gradually slowed, deepened, sleep taking them, and Laika remained between them, still and calm, a quiet presence in the darkness. In the living area, Yostovsky sat with his wife. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. Tomorrow Laika would turn to the facility. The day after, final preparations, and then the launch. But tonight she was here, in a home, with a family, being treated the way a dog should be treated, with gentleness, with inclusion, with the simple assumption that her comfort and well-being mattered. Later, much later, Yostovsky would write about this evening, would describe Laika as quiet and charming, would explain that he wanted to do something kind for her because she had so little time left. Those words, "so little time left," carry the weight of knowledge, the weight of knowing what was coming, of understanding that this small act of kindness was all he could offer, that the larger forces of the mission, the program, the political demands Those were beyond his power to change. But this evening, this home, this family, this normal, ordinary time, this he could give her, and so he did. The night deepened, the apartment grew quiet, the children slept, their parents slept, and Laika rested on the floor between the children's beds, warm and comfortable and safe. She didn't know this was temporary, didn't understand that tomorrow would bring a return to the facility, that this was a brief island of normalcy in a sea of preparation for something unprecedented. She only knew the now, the softness beneath her, the warmth of the apartment, the gentle breathing of the sleeping children, the feeling of being in a space where she was wanted, where she belonged, and where she mattered. The cushion was soft, the air was warm, the home was quiet in a way homes are quiet at night, full of small sounds, the building settling, distant traffic, the breathing of the people who lived there. All of it familiar and safe and good. Laika's eyes closed, her breathing deepened. Real rest, not the weary half-sleep of the kennels, not the tense waiting of the training cages, but genuine rest, the kind that comes when you feel safe, when you've been treated with kindness, when the world, for this moment, is exactly as it should be. In her sleep, perhaps she dreamed of what we could never know, perhaps of the streets where she'd once lived, perhaps of this warm apartment, perhaps of nothing at all, just the deep restorative nothingness of true rest. The night passed, morning would come as mornings do. Yazdovsky would take her back to the facility. The mission would proceed. History would unfold as it was always going to unfold. But this night, this one night, Laika slept in her home, between two children who thought she was wonderful, in an apartment where she'd been treated as a guest of honor, where people had wanted to give her something good, simply because she deserved it. This is where we leave her, not in a capsule, not in the cold of space, not in the tragedy of what came after, but here in this warm apartment, on this soft cushion, between these sleeping children, in this moment of peace. She is comfortable and safe and cared for. She is, in this moment, experiencing what all dogs should experience, the warmth of a home, the kindness of people who see her as more than a tool or a subject, the simple gift of rest. But it wasn't enough. One evening couldn't balance what was coming, couldn't change her fate, and couldn't undo the mission, or the one-way journey, or the tragedy. But it was something. It was kindness. It was recognition that this small life had value, that doing something kind mattered, even when you couldn't change the larger story, that giving comfort to a being who would soon suffer was worth doing, simply because it was right. And in the quiet darkness of a Moscow apartment, there is peace, there is warmth, there is the particular grace that comes from treating another being with gentleness. Rest now, Laika, in this home, in this warmth, in this kindness. You were seen and you were valued. You were given this gift, and we remember. The pawprints fade, but the story remains. Good night.